The Millionaire family mocked the quiet hotel maid until she grabbed the mic, shattered their arrogance, and left them absolutely speechless. She had mopped their floors, made their beds, and smiled through their cruelty. But tonight, everything would change. This invisible woman was about to flip the script on New York's most elite. Grace Ellis had been hiding in plain sight, scrubbing bathrooms by day and guarding $1 billion secret by night. When she stepped into the gala, microphone in hand, 500 rich guests didn't know they were about to witness the most humiliating public reckoning of their lives. But the real twist, she didn't just expose them, she owned everything they stood on. This isn't revenge, it's revelation. The sun was barely up when Grace Ellis stepped out of her one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx and into the misty chill of another Manhattan morning. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her sneakers spotless, and her expression unreadable. To anyone watching, she was just another hotel maid starting her day at the Grand Amaranth Hotel, one of the most exclusive five-star destinations in the city. But Grace wasn't just a maid, and today wouldn't be just another day. She clutched the handle of her cleaning cart with practiced ease, weaving through the lobby's back entrance unnoticed. Guests came in through marble arches and gold-trimmed revolving doors. Grace came in through a narrow hallway that smelled like detergent and exhaustion. That was the point. For 2 years, she had scrubbed floors, made beds, and smiled through snide comments. She cleaned up after tantrums thrown by billionaires' children, wiped lipstick off marble countertops, and watched powerful people treat her like wallpaper. And she had done it all without flinching. Because this was the test. Her late grandmother, Olivia Ellis, once the wealthiest black woman in the Northeast, had built an empire out of nothing but grit, brilliance, and strategy. She had survived poverty, racism, and betrayal, and still turned a single brownstone into a real estate dynasty that spanned cities. When she passed, her will shocked even the lawyers. Grace, her only heir, would inherit the entire $50 billion fortune, but under one condition. She must spend 2 years living like the people society ignores. No contact with old friends, no luxury, no special treatment, and absolutely no revealing her identity. Grace remembered the words from the final letter her grandmother had written. If you want to lead people, you must first understand what it means to serve. This is not punishment. It is your sharpening. You cannot carry a crown with soft hands. And so Grace had disappeared. She gave up the penthouse, the black card, the driver. She traded Versace for scrubs and became one of the hundreds of nameless hotel workers who made the luxury machine run. No one looked twice at her. That was the power of a uniform and a title. Today she had only 17 days left. 17 more sunrises until she could walk back into the world with her head high and her fortune intact. But the world had other plans. She was halfway through changing the linens in room 1702 when she got the call from the front desk. VIP guests had arrived early and demanded the best suite, room 1901, be recleaned immediately. Grace didn't argue. She wiped the sweat from her brow, adjusted her gloves, and made her way upstairs. When the elevator doors opened, she saw them, the DeWitt family. James DeWitt III was a financier who had made his name and billions during the tech mergers of the early 2000s. His face had been on the cover of Forbes, and his scandals had graced the headlines of Page 6. His wife, Vivienne, was the daughter of a shipping magnate. Their son, Carter, was known more for his reckless behavior than any actual accomplishment, and their daughter, Ava, trailed behind them like a ghost with a phone permanently attached to her hand. Grace didn't need a name tag to recognize them. She had scrubbed their names off headlines and stock tickers her whole life. This was generational wealth, old money, the kind of people who thought civility was optional if you had enough zeros in your bank account. "Hey you," James said, snapping his fingers as she approached. "This room's filthy. You're going to have to do it again, and this time try using your back." Grace didn't blink. "Of course, sir, I'll get started right away." Vivienne gave her a look that dripped with disapproval. "And please do something about the smell, it's oppressive." Carter laughed under his breath. "Maybe it's her." Grace's jaw tightened for half a second. She turned her attention to the bed, pulling back the sheets with a controlled, methodical precision. You know, Vivienne said, settling into the velvet armchair near the window, I've always wondered what it's like to clean after people like us. Doesn't it ever bother you, seeing what you'll never have? Grace didn't answer. She couldn't, not without revealing everything. James chimed in, enjoying himself now. Come on, we're curious. What's your dream? To save up and own a cleaning company, or do you think you'll marry rich? That's usually the fantasy, isn't it? Ava barely looked up from her phone. Dad, she's not listening. People like her learn early not to talk unless spoken to. Grace's hands moved faster, tucking corners, smoothing wrinkles, polishing wood. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her face was calm. This wasn't new. This wasn't the worst. But something about this family, about the casual venom in their tone, pulled at something raw and ancient inside her. You have a name? Carter asked, leaning against the dresser like he owned the air in the room. Grace, she said simply. That's ironic, Vivienne murmured. The room fell silent for a beat. Then James chuckled. Well, Grace, I hope you enjoy tonight's event. We'll be making a few key announcements at the gala, and maybe you'll get a glimpse of what real success looks like. Grace paused just long enough for James to notice. You are working the event, aren't you? Of course you are. It must be so inspiring to serve champagne to your betters. She turned and looked at him squarely, not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet, lethal clarity. It's always enlightening, she said, and returned to her work. They didn't hear the edge in her voice. They didn't notice the shift in her spine. They didn't see that the woman folding their towels could buy the suite they were staying in with one swipe of her card. But they would. Tonight, under the chandeliered ceiling of the Amaranth's grand ballroom, everything would change. Grace had been invisible for long enough. Grace exited the suite and wheeled her cart down the corridor in silence. The wheels creaked softly over the thick carpet, a sound too familiar to be noticed by anyone else. But to her, it was the rhythm of patience, of restraint. Every corner she turned brought her closer to the gala. She could already see the staff preparing, the catering crew unloading carts of hors d'oeuvres, decorators adjusting centerpieces, security running final checks. She was no stranger to events like this. Before the experiment began, she'd stood on the other side of the velvet ropes, smiling for cameras, making speeches, cutting donation checks. Her name had once held power in the same rooms the DeWitts now sought to impress. The difference was, Grace never needed validation, and she never forgot where her family came from. 2 hours later, she stood in the staff kitchen of the Amaranth, steam rising from industrial coffee pots, trays clinking as servers filled them with champagne flutes and napkin-folded hors d'oeuvres. She wore the same black uniform as the rest of the catering staff now, her hotel badge tucked away in her locker. The switch was easy. She had volunteered to help with the event under a different role weeks ago. One more lesson in humility, one more crack in the old world's illusion of class. Ellis, you're on ballroom C entry, front right rotation, said the floor captain, clipboard in hand and voice as sharp as her bun. No drop-offs, hold the tray steady, smile with your mouth, not your eyes, got it? Got it, Grace replied. She picked up her tray and stepped into the ballroom, her posture perfect, her steps steady. The room looked like something out of a dream, chandeliers dripping crystal light, string quartets humming from the shadows, gold-edged table settings so pristine they looked untouched by mortal hands. The guests were filtering in now, draped in gowns and suits that cost more than most people's yearly income. And at the center of it all, the DeWitts. They held court near the front, drinks already in hand, laughing with a senator, a venture capitalist, and a woman whose perfume entered the room before she did. Vivienne's laughter trilled above the string music like a champagne glass ringing in a toast. James surveyed the room like a general preparing for war, nodding to CEOs and whispering to donors. Carter was already on his third glass of something brown and expensive. And Ava. She barely noticed the people around her, consumed by her screen like it held more relevance than the living humans in the room. Grace moved between the guests unnoticed, placing drinks into eager hands and dodging elbow nudges and careless swipes. A man waved his glass lazily in her direction without looking up. She filled it. Another guest barked, napkin, like a command. She handed it over. She was Grace Ellis here, She wasn't the heir to a fortune. She was just another invisible silhouette making their night seamless. But not everyone was blind. Mrs. Jeanette Lawson stood by the far wall, watching Grace, with the curiosity of someone who couldn't quite place a face, but knew it mattered. A retired civil rights attorney and longtime philanthropist, Jeanette had met Grace once at a UN dinner hosted by Olivia Ellis. That night, Grace had worn sapphire and given a speech about educational equity. Tonight, she held a tray of shrimp canapés. Jeanette's brow furrowed. She tilted her head, took a step forward, then paused. She didn't approach, not yet, but her gaze stayed locked. Grace noticed. She tucked a curl behind her ear and lowered her eyes. This wasn't the moment, not yet. She circled back toward the entry as the MC's voice rang out over the sound system, welcoming guests and signaling the beginning of the evening's program. Polite applause rippled through the crowd as Preston Martin, the hotel's managing director, stepped onto the stage. He delivered a quick speech about hospitality and tradition, full of charm and fluff. But it was what came next that made the air shift. "Our next speaker," Preston said, "is someone you all know, a man whose commitment to public service is matched only by his success in the business world. Please welcome tonight's honorary chair, Mr. James DeWitt, III." The applause was thunderous, almost performative in its enthusiasm. James stepped onto the stage like he belonged there, which, to his mind, he absolutely did. His smile was calibrated, his suit tailored within a millimeter of flawlessness. He was everything a room like this expected. Grace shifted to the back of the room, where other catering staff stood waiting like shadows against the wall. She watched him take the mic, watched him scan the audience like a man about to deliver scripture to his disciples. "I'm honored to be here tonight," James began, his voice smooth as silk dipped in oil. "Honored to be among such generosity, such vision, and most importantly, among people who understand that success is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated." Applause again, predictable, empty. "My family has always believed in excellence," he continued, "in legacy, in the idea that those of us who have been fortunate enough to thrive owe it to our communities to lead with strength." Grace's stomach turned. This city was built by men and women who didn't apologize for ambition, who rose through grit, determination, and a refusal to accept mediocrity. That's the spirit we honor tonight. Grace stepped back into the hallway, unable to keep listening. She set down her tray, her hands trembling, not from fear, but fury. The very man who had ridiculed her for existing outside his definition of worth was now preaching about character and legacy. She found a quiet corridor behind the ballroom and pulled out her phone. There were only two people she had allowed herself to remain in contact with during the experiment: an attorney who monitored her estate and her godmother, Melinda, who had served as Olivia's right hand for nearly 30 years. She texted one sentence: "I need the full deed packet for the Amaranth Hotel, now." Less than 60 seconds later, her phone buzzed. "On the way, are you ready?" "Yes," she typed. "Tonight the silence ends." Back in the ballroom, James was wrapping up his speech, milking the last applause like it was currency. Vivienne beamed. Carter winked at someone across the room. Ava had finally looked up from her phone. And then the music started again, the servers flowed back in, and the illusion resumed. Grace returned to the floor with a new tray in hand, but this time her mind wasn't on service. It was on timing. 10 tables down, at the far right corner, sat another name the world knew well: Edward Knox, billionaire investor and chairman of the Knox Foundation. A man whose company had once partnered with Olivia Ellis Enterprises until he tried to buy them out with shady terms. Olivia had declined, gracefully, publicly, and then quietly bought the building where his flagship office operated. Edward didn't recognize Grace as she offered him a drink. Why would he? Last time they were in the same room, she was wearing a gown and making a keynote address at a corporate gala in D.C. tonight. He gave her a passing glance and took his glass without a word. She moved on, but she clocked every face, every name, every piece of leverage in the room. And then she saw him. Elijah Brenner. He was standing near the back bar, dressed in black like the rest of the staff. But Grace knew better. He wasn't staff. He was a private consultant, security, PR damage control, event reputation management. If he was here, it meant the DeWitts were preparing to announce something big, political, risky. Which meant they were vulnerable. Grace moved toward the side corridor again. She needed air and clarity. She passed a large display of auction items near the ballroom's west wing. Luxury vacations, custom artwork, a private dinner with a Michelin chef. But one item stopped her cold. A framed, autographed photograph of Olivia Ellis. The caption underneath read, "In honor of a legacy that redefined possibility, donated anonymously." Grace stared at the frame, her throat tight. She hadn't known it would be here. She hadn't expected her grandmother's face, her power, to be used as a silent tribute in a room that would never have accepted her alive. She took one deep breath, then another. It was time. She turned and walked toward the staff corridor again, her eyes hard, her steps certain. The world had ignored Grace Ellis for 2 years. Tonight, it would remember her name. The kitchen hallway buzzed with movement, but Grace moved through it like a current against the tide. She passed waiters prepping trays and sommeliers reviewing wine cards, but her focus didn't waver. Her tray was now empty, but it didn't matter. She had what she needed. Back in the staff locker room, she removed the catering vest and replaced it with her hotel housekeeping badge. She wasn't done blending in, she was about to blend in more purposefully than ever. 2 uniforms, 2 roles, 2 levels of invisibility. The perfect cover for someone who needed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. She slipped into the administrative wing on the 2nd floor, a restricted area most staff avoided unless summoned. But Grace had mapped this place in her mind over months. She knew the cameras. She knew when the shift rotations changed. She even knew the name of the tech intern who accidentally left the Wi-Fi password taped under the IT desk. She entered the small utility office where the soundboard and microphone feeds were controlled for ballroom events. Normally, this room would be locked and monitored, but tonight's technician had left for a 10-minute break. Long enough. Grace didn't need to sabotage anything. She didn't need to hack the system or make a grand entrance. She simply opened a secured drawer, pulled out the backup handheld mic labeled Ballroom B, and slid it into her jacket pocket. It was synced, tested, and battery-checked, ready to broadcast with the push of a button. As she left the office, her phone buzzed. "Melinda, deed packet uploaded. You officially own the Amaranth Hotel. No press alert unless you say go." Grace smiled faintly. So that was it. She didn't just work here. She owned the walls, the chandeliers, the marble floors, and the carpet the DeWitts had walked on in contempt. The staff they ignored, her employees, the suite they'd slept in, her property. And she was done pretending otherwise. In the ballroom, the auctioneer had returned to the stage, animated and grinning. And now, ladies and gentlemen, an exclusive surprise from tonight's honorary family, something you won't find on any sheet. James DeWitt was already rising from his chair. Vivienne clutched her champagne glass tighter, smiling with the poised precision of a woman used to public applause. Carter slouched deeper in his seat, clearly bored but camera-aware. Ava didn't look up from her phone, but her posture shifted ever so slightly, aware this moment was being recorded. James took the mic, basking in the attention like it fueled him. "We are thrilled to announce," he said, gesturing behind him as a banner unfurled on the ballroom screen, "the launch of the DeWitt Initiative, an elite mentorship and education program for young entrepreneurs in underserved communities." The screen filled with a promotional video. Dramatic music played, footage of schoolyards, eager children, computer labs, and James shaking hands with interns played out like a campaign ad. Every frame was manicured, every smile rehearsed. Grace re-entered the room through the side aisle, slowly making her way around the perimeter. She could hear murmurs of approval. Applause swelled again. James raised a hand to quiet the room. "This program will pair promising youth with some of the brightest minds in finance and tech. We believe in creating pathways for success, not through handouts, but through hard-earned opportunity. These young people will be shown what excellence looks like. He let the line hang for effect. Vivienne beamed at the camera. Carter adjusted his cufflinks. Ava finally pocketed her phone. People often ask us, James continued, what real legacy looks like. And we tell them, legacy is building something that outlasts you, something that uplifts those willing to earn their place at the table. Grace stopped walking. She was standing just 20 feet from the front row, still in uniform, holding the microphone in her pocket like a secret weapon. James had no idea he was standing on the edge of a cliff. And I think, James said, lowering his voice to a tone meant to sound authentic, that the greatest gift we can give is to teach people their value, to show them what's possible when they stop waiting for permission and start rising on their own merit. That was the moment. Grace stepped forward. She didn't shout, she didn't break the decorum with a dramatic announcement. She simply raised the mic, clicked it on, and began to speak. May I add something? The sound of her voice echoed through the ballroom, smooth and amplified, threading its way into every corner. James froze mid-sentence. His eyes scanned the room, confused. Guests turned in their chairs, heads pivoted. The orchestra stilled. She walked slowly into the center aisle, spotlight catching the curve of her cheekbone, the simple cut of her hotel uniform, the shine of polished black shoes. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice level, calm, unshaken, but since we're talking about legacy, I think it's only fair we talk about truth. A silence, heavier than any applause, filled the room. James furrowed his brow. Excuse me, miss, but this is a private ballroom. Grace finished for him. Yes, I'm aware, I also own it. The silence cracked. A ripple passed through the room, a sharp wave of murmurs and gasps, like someone had dropped a crystal flute onto stone. James blinked. What? Grace stepped onto the stage. My name is Grace Ellis. I'm the granddaughter of Olivia Ellis. I've been working at this hotel for the last 2 years under conditions set in her will. A condition that I live among the people society overlooks before inheriting her estate. She turned toward the audience now, scanning the stunned faces. Donors, politicians, executives, all looking up at a woman they had ignored or insulted or dismissed. That condition has been fulfilled, and as of midnight last night, I became the legal owner of the Amaranth Hotel and the executor of the Ellis Foundation. James stepped back slightly, color draining from his face. Vivienne's glass trembled just enough to chime. I've scrubbed toilets in this building. I've changed sheets for suites bigger than my apartment. I've watched people like you, she said, her gaze locking on James, belittle staff, mock the poor, and pretend that decency is something you can outsource. Guests whispered now, names exchanged in hushed awe. Journalists in the crowd had their phones out. Somewhere, a camera light switched on. Grace didn't flinch. Tonight, you unveiled a mentorship program, she continued. And while I respect the concept, I have to ask, how many people did you step on before you decided it was time to lift someone up? James moved forward, trying to recover. Miss Ellis, if you have a grievance. No, Mr. DeWitt, she interrupted. I have a memory of you snapping your fingers at me like I was an animal, of your wife asking if my dreams ended at cleaning a room, of your son laughing as if dignity were optional, and of your daughter, well, she paused. She barely noticed anyone at all. Ava flushed red. Carter looked away. Vivienne opened her mouth and closed it. I don't share this to embarrass you, Grace said, her tone softening slightly. I share it to hold a mirror up to the kind of legacy we pretend is honorable. Wealth does not excuse cruelty. Power does not justify humiliation. And legacy, she looked directly into the camera now, her voice gentle but thunderous. Legacy is not built by what you say at galas. It's built by what you do when no one's watching. Silence. No claps, no gasps, just stillness. Charlotte DeWitt stood slowly from her chair near the front, all eyes turned. She walked up to the stage, heels clicking softly. She looked at Grace with a gaze so full of realization and something close to gratitude that Grace almost faltered. "I believe you," Charlotte said, her voice clear and unafraid, "and I'm sorry." The room breathed again. And then, impossibly, applause began. Not everyone clapped, not everyone understood, but someone did. And Grace Ellis, housekeeper, billionaire, granddaughter of a woman who changed the world, stood taller than ever before. This was not the end. This was only part 3. Grace stood still as the applause faded, but her heart beat with a clarity she hadn't felt in 2 years. The moment had landed, not with spectacle, but with truth. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't threatened or exposed anyone's secrets. She had simply spoken, and in a room built on image and ego, that alone was revolutionary. The ballroom, once a theater of performative generosity, was now a stage of raw tension. Guests glanced sideways, unsure whether to praise her or fear her. Some still held their wine glasses midair, caught between sipping and gasping. Others stared at her in dawning recognition, realizing they'd crossed paths with her in the past, perhaps rudely, perhaps casually, and never noticed her humanity. James DeWitt stood frozen. His legacy moment, his polished speech, his launch video, his banner, his curated applause, had been hijacked by a woman he had dismissed just hours ago. But Grace didn't look at him, she looked at the staff. Dozens of them stood at the edges of the room, dressed in black and white, trained to move without being seen. Servers, dishwashers, attendants, people who'd been ignored so long it had become second nature. She caught the eye of one Miguel, the server who had spilled a drink earlier and endured public embarrassment. He stood near the side wall, wide-eyed, gripping an empty tray. When their eyes met, he gave her the smallest nod. That was enough. Grace stepped back from the microphone, handing it silently to the event coordinator, whose hands trembled as he took it. She walked off stage, not with retreat, but with poise. Each step was deliberate, grounded, confident. She wasn't escaping, she had arrived. Charlotte fell into step beside her. They didn't speak right away. The silence between them felt sacred, like the stillness after a thunderstorm, where the air is charged with newness. "I knew something was off," Charlotte finally said. "You didn't carry yourself like the rest of the staff. You didn't speak like them." Grace glanced at her, a wry smile tugging the corner of her lips. "Is that a compliment or a judgment?" Charlotte flushed. I noticed, I saw the difference, and then I started wondering if the difference was in you or in me." Grace didn't answer right away. "You asked earlier if people like your family can change. I still think they can, but only if someone in the room is brave enough to ask why they haven't." Charlotte swallowed. "Tonight changed something in me." Grace paused at the side hallway, just beyond view of the main ballroom. "Good, then maybe it was worth it." Vivienne's voice sliced through the moment like broken glass. "How dare you?" They both turned. Vivienne DeWitt stood a few paces away, her gown shimmering under the hallway lights, her expression somewhere between shock and venom. James wasn't with her. Neither were Carter or Ava. She had come alone, which made her words feel more raw. "You ambushed us," Vivienne hissed. "You humiliated my family." "No," Grace said calmly. "Your family did that to yourselves. I just gave the room a microphone." Vivienne stepped closer, her fury trembling beneath her skin. "Do you think this makes you noble? You used us. You used this event. You waited until the perfect moment to upstage everything we worked for." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You mean the speech, the donations, or the curated image of generosity built on public belittling?" Vivienne faltered for a fraction of a second. "We were trying to do good." "Were you?" Grace asked, her voice softer now, but edged with steel. "Then maybe start by treating people like human beings, even when they're not on a gala stage." Vivienne opened her mouth, but no words came. She turned on her heels and stalked away, her heels echoing like a retreating war drum. Charlotte looked down. "I'm sorry." "You already said that," Grace replied, not unkindly. "But I am," Charlotte insisted, "for all of it, for staying silent too long, for not seeing what was in front of me, for needing you to shatter the illusion before I started asking questions." Grace exhaled. Then ask the next one. Charlotte blinked. What? You already asked if people like your family can change. Ask the next question. Charlotte looked at her, searching for the right words. Can I? Grace smiled for the first time that night. That's the only question that ever mattered. They parted ways at the end of the hall. Charlotte returned to her family's table, though her seat felt colder now, more distant. Grace returned to the staff corridor, where the catering team stared at her like she was made of moonlight and myth. Maria, a server who'd worked at the hotel for over 20 years, stepped forward. You own this place? She asked, voice trembling. Grace nodded. And you still worked here all this time? Grace looked around at the faces, tired, hard-working, loyal, and her voice lowered. I didn't come here to prove something, I came to remember something, and I did. Maria's eyes welled with tears. You don't know what it means to have someone like you see us, really see us. Grace reached out and took her hand. Oh, I do, I've been you. In the quiet that followed, another staff member approached, Tamaz, the pastry chef who worked 14-hour shifts to send his daughter to college. He didn't speak, just held out a folded piece of paper. Grace took it and opened it. It was a sketch of her, drawn from memory in charcoal pencil. Her in the hotel uniform, pushing a cart, a halo of light drawn around her head like a saint. She's the patron saint of the invisible, Tamaz said, half joking, half not. Grace blinked back a tear and folded the sketch carefully. I'll keep this, I promise. The night went on. The gala limped toward its conclusion. James DeWitt did not speak again. The DeWitt Initiative banner was quietly rolled up and removed. No one danced. The music continued, but it no longer filled the room, it merely echoed in it. Charlotte stayed at the table, silent, watching her father's mask begin to crack. Back in her modest apartment later that night, Grace placed the sketch from Tamaz in her desk drawer. She sat down, kicked off her shoes, and stared out the window. 17 days. That's how long she had left in this experiment, but she wasn't counting anymore. Because the lesson had arrived early. Her grandmother hadn't wanted to punish her. She wanted her to feel, to know what power did to people when it forgot where it came from. She wanted her to see what kindness could do, even in silence. And most of all, she wanted Grace to lead not from above, but from among. A knock came at the door. Grace opened it slowly. Standing there, still in a gala gown, and now holding a notebook, was Charlotte. I don't want this to be the end, she said, breathless. Not of the night, not of the conversation. I want to know what to read, what to study, what to change. Grace didn't answer right away. She stepped aside and held the door open. Then come in, she said. And Charlotte did. Because the real legacy wasn't built in ballrooms or banner unveilings, it was built in moments like this, quiet, determined, brave. Charlotte stepped into Grace's apartment and paused. It was small, modest by anyone's standards, but it felt lived in, personal. A single couch near a bookshelf stuffed with worn paperbacks, a round table holding a plant struggling to survive under a lamp, and a desk tucked in the corner, littered with handwritten notes and unopened letters. The room smelled faintly of coffee, lavender, and something grounding, like paper and warm dust. A room that had witnessed thought, restraint, and patience. Charlotte looked around slowly, as if she were trespassing inside someone's truth. Grace poured her a glass of water from the fridge and handed it over wordlessly. Charlotte took it, surprised by how dry her mouth had gone since stepping away from the noise of her family. The silence in the room didn't feel awkward, it felt deserved. Sit, Grace said gently. Charlotte did, perching at the edge of the couch like a student awaiting her first lesson. I didn't come here to intrude, she said. I couldn't go home, not after what happened tonight. Grace sat across from her, folding one leg over the other. Her uniform was still crisp, her expression composed, but there was something deeper in her posture now, something unshackled. Then don't go home, Grace replied, not until you decide what home should mean to you. Charlotte blinked at that. I never thought to question it, My family's home is made of marble and velvet and staff who appear before we can even ask for something. I thought that was just normal. Grace tilted her head. It is normal for you. That's the trick of privilege. It convinces you that your version of the world is the baseline. Charlotte nodded slowly, taking a sip of water. Tonight I felt it, the gap between us and everyone else. Not just money, but awareness. My father speaks about hard work like it's a medal he earned, but he's never waited on a train platform. My mother praises charity, but never speaks to the people she writes checks for. And me, I've smiled at waiters without knowing their names. I've posted selfies while people around me folded napkins in the background. Grace was quiet for a moment. What changed for you tonight? Charlotte looked up. You, and the way my family didn't see you coming. Grace didn't smile. She leaned forward, voice even. You did. I wanted to, Charlotte said. I just didn't know what I was seeing. That's how change starts, Grace said. Not with answers, but with better questions. Charlotte set her glass down. Then here's one. Why did you go through with it? Why take the 2 years? You could have walked into your inheritance, skipped the humiliation, stayed in penthouses, and still made donations. Grace sat back, exhaling. Because my grandmother didn't want me to own wealth. She wanted me to understand it. She wanted me to see how the world treats you when it thinks you're nobody. Because if I ever forget that, I don't deserve the power that money gives me. Charlotte leaned back, processing. That's what's been haunting me, not just that we're rich, but that we've never questioned what that means. We've never asked what it costs. Grace reached for a small book on the table, leather-bound, frayed at the edges. She handed it to Charlotte. My grandmother's journal, Grace explained. That's what kept me sane these past 2 years. She wrote through everything, the rise, the betrayal, the fight to be seen in a city that wanted to keep her invisible. Charlotte opened it with reverence, her eyes scanning the first page. Wealth is not a ladder, it is a mirror. It reflects who we already are, not who we wish to become. She sounds like someone I wish I'd known, Charlotte said softly. Grace smiled for real this time. You still can, through what you choose next. They spent the next hour talking, not about money or scandals or legacies, but about books, ideas, what kind of cities they wanted to live in. Charlotte asked questions. Grace answered some, left others hanging for her to ponder. The conversation had no power dynamic, no stage, just two women from different ends of the same line trying to redraw it together. By the time Charlotte stood to leave, the sky outside had begun to lighten. Morning was near. Will you be at the hotel today? She asked. Grace nodded, for now. And after the 17 days? I haven't decided, Grace replied honestly, but I know one thing, I'm not going back to being invisible. Charlotte held her gaze, neither am I. Grace watched her leave, standing at the window as Charlotte disappeared down the street, her emerald gown hidden beneath an oversized coat. The girl who had entered as an heiress left as something braver, a questioner. 3 hours later, the story broke. A mid-level reporter at the New York Ledger published a headline that hit every major network within minutes. Heir to billion-dollar empire revealed as housekeeper at Amaranth Hotel. The photo was grainy, Grace pushing a cleaning cart down a marble hallway, but the article beneath it had receipts, the deed transfer, the conditions of Olivia Ellis's will, the confirmed identity of Grace Ellis as the sole heir to one of the most powerful real estate fortunes in the country. Within an hour, it was trending globally. Staff at the Amaranth read it between laundry runs and room turnovers. Guests spilled their morning coffee reading it in the lounge. Talk shows speculated. Pundits argued. Social media blew up with hashtags. Invisible no more. #Grace Ellis #housekeeper heir. Some called it the greatest social experiment of the decade. Others accused her of deception. Still others, especially service workers, called her a hero. The DeWitts. They vanished from public view, no press statements, no follow-ups. Their PR team sent a brief, sterile comment. The DeWitt family had no knowledge of Ms. Ellis's identity and wishes her the best in her future endeavors. But silence, for people of influence, spoke volumes. James's name was quietly removed from 2 corporate boards. A senator distanced himself publicly. The DeWitt Initiative, less than 24 hours old, shuttered its website. At the Amaranth, staff gathered in clusters, some laughing, others stunned. Maria from the catering team placed a printed copy of the article on the staff bulletin board and wrote in Sharpie at the top, "Our boss has a broom and $1 billion." Grace stayed in her room that morning, sipping coffee and letting the chaos burn itself out. She hadn't planned to go public, not yet, but she wasn't running from it either. Her phone buzzed constantly. Interviews, offers, talk shows, endorsements, podcasts. She didn't respond. Instead, she called Melinda. "It started," Grace said. "Yes," Melinda replied calmly, "and you handled it like Olivia would have, maybe better." "I didn't expect the story to go viral this fast." "Of course not," Melinda said, "because you're not used to being the news. You're used to being the story behind the story, but that's over now." Grace nodded, even though no one could see her. "It has to mean something." "It already does." As she hung up, Grace looked around the room that had been both prison and cocoon. Everything inside had served its purpose. The chipped table, the folding chair, the second-hand mirror. It wasn't a home, but it had made her human. She opened her laptop and clicked into the foundation account. Hundreds of emails were flooding in, requests for funding, testimonials, press inquiries, but one caught her eye. A school in Harlem, her grandmother's first neighborhood. A letter from the principal. "We didn't realize until today that the grant came from you. Whoever you were pretending to be, you saw us. Thank you for never forgetting where greatness starts." Grace smiled. Then slowly, deliberately, she began to type. The message Grace began to type wasn't just a press release, it was a declaration. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, not to second-guess herself, but to make sure every word was chosen with precision. She wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity. She didn't want applause or viral fame, but she understood the moment. She understood its power. Her grandmother had taught her, use the microphone only when silence becomes complicity. And silence, in this moment, would have been a betrayal. She typed, "To everyone asking who I am. I'm Grace Ellis, granddaughter of Olivia Ellis. Yes, I was a hotel housekeeper. Yes, I cleaned bathrooms and made beds and scrubbed floors. I also own the building I worked in. For 2 years, I walked among those who are ignored, unseen, underestimated. I was not undercover for scandal or performance. I was fulfilling a condition left to me by a woman who believed that real wealth is understanding what it costs to be invisible. I didn't learn dignity from the rich. I learned it from Maria, who sends half her paycheck back home every month without complaint. From Miguel, who memorizes guests' allergies better than any catering system. From the janitor, who knows every child's name in the building because he treats everyone like they matter. So no, I didn't come from nothing. I came from people you refuse to see. And now that I'm visible, I won't disappear." She hit send. It posted on the Ellis Foundation's site first, then across her verified social platforms, accounts that had been inactive for almost 2 years, now reawakened with a message the world didn't expect. Within 15 minutes, her inbox overflowed. The quote that traveled fastest was the line, "I didn't learn dignity from the rich." It was screenshotted, quoted, stitched into reaction videos, placed over orchestral TikToks, and reshared by celebrities, activists, and ordinary workers who finally saw themselves in the woman who'd stood quietly with a vacuum in hand, and then taken over the room. Grace watched none of it. Instead, she returned to the hotel. She entered through the same side entrance she had for 2 years, out of habit, not necessity. Heads turned immediately. A few housekeepers froze mid-task. Security gave her a half-salute, half-confused wave. Even Preston Martin, the hotel director, was in the lobby, clearly expecting her. "Miss Ellis," he said, the moment she stepped onto the polished marble. "Well, good morning." She didn't pause. "Preston, has the staff been briefed?" He blinked. "Somewhat. There's been, well, speculation." "Then let's clear it up," she said calmly. "I want a staff meeting today, full team, 2:00 p.m. Grand Ballroom." "Of course," he said, and to his credit, didn't stammer the way some others might have. Grace continued toward the staff elevators. As she passed the front desk, Tommy looked up from behind the counter, his mouth open slightly in stunned recognition. "Grace," he said, "you're..." "I'm still me," she said, stopping, "just a little less anonymous." He smiled slowly, proudly. "Told you there was something different about you." She chuckled and moved on, riding the elevator to the 17th floor, not to check on rooms, but to visit the one she had cleaned the day before, the DeWitt's suite. It was empty now, abandoned in haste sometime during the early morning hours. The "Do Not Disturb" sign had been replaced with a discreet, vacated tag. The door had already been left open for inspection. Grace entered. The room was still pristine, nothing had been trashed. The expensive flowers still bloomed in their vases. Only the silence told the truth. The family that had occupied it no longer held the same stature. The DeWitts had been exposed, not by some tabloid scandal, but by a woman they'd written off before they knew her name. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the skyline. It looked different now, not because the buildings had changed, but because she had. The city no longer loomed over her like an unreachable crown. She was part of it now, its heartbeat, its future, its reckoning. At 2:00 p.m., the ballroom was full. Every department was represented: housekeeping, kitchen, front desk, engineering, maintenance. Men and women in black polos, scrubs, aprons, and suits all sat in neat rows beneath the crystal chandeliers, unsure whether to clap or just breathe. When Grace stepped onto the stage, she wasn't dressed in designer silk or sharp tailoring. She wore the same uniform she'd worn the night before. Because nothing about her message required a costume. "Thank you for coming," she began. No microphone was needed. The silence was its own amplifier. "Most of you already know, some of you probably suspected, but let me say it out loud to all of you first, before the news finishes writing my story for me." She took a deep breath. "My name is Grace Ellis. I'm the new owner of this hotel and the heiress of Olivia Ellis's estate." A wave of quiet surprise moved through the room, but no one left, no one scoffed. They were listening. "For 2 years I worked beside you, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand what this industry really looks like from the inside. I've scrubbed toilets, carried room service trays, and wiped tears off bathroom counters. I've watched you handle difficult guests with grace. I've watched you show more discipline, compassion, and professionalism than the people who walk through those gold doors upstairs." A few nods. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm not here to pull a publicity stunt. I'm here because I made a promise to myself and to my grandmother that I would never forget where respect is earned." She paused. "So here's what's going to happen next." You could hear pens uncapping. Some staff pulled out their phones to take notes. 1. Everyone who has worked here for at least 6 months will receive a pay adjustment, effective immediately, to reflect not just market rates, but respect. Murmurs, then a few claps, then more. 2. Every department will participate in a roundtable discussion this month to review labor conditions, break schedules, and feedback protocols. If I missed anything in my 2 years here, I want to hear it from you. Now the claps were louder. And 3, we will be launching the Olivia Ellis Fellowship, fully funded, to support the continued education and career advancement of our staff and their families. Whether you want to pursue hotel management, real estate, business, or even something totally different, we're going to help you do it. The applause was full now. Some stood. A few had tears in their eyes. Miguel near the back let out a loud woo that made everyone laugh. Grace held up her hands to settle them. "But more than that," she said, "I want you to know this. Her voice lowered. You are not invisible, not anymore, not to me, not to the future of this place. This hotel was built to impress the powerful, but going forward, it will honor the people who actually make it run. The standing ovation that followed was unlike any gala applause she'd ever heard. It wasn't curated or polite. It was real. It was theirs. As the applause settled, Maria approached the stage. Grace stepped down to meet her. Maria embraced her, not with awkwardness, but with the raw familiarity of someone who had once whispered comfort into her ears in the staff lounge when no one else dared to speak up. You didn't have to come back, Maria said. I never left, Grace replied. And with that, the hotel wasn't just hers by name. It was hers by heart. By the following morning, the entire city felt different. Not because the skyline had shifted or the traffic had calmed, but because of one woman's name now etched into every headline, talk show monologue, and street corner conversation. Grace Ellis wasn't just a news story anymore. She had become a symbol of quiet strength, of earned power, of justice without vengeance. But Grace didn't care about any of that. While the media speculated about her next move and social media turned her quotes into graphics and merchandise, she was sitting in a modest classroom in Harlem, speaking to a group of high school juniors about what it meant to build a life with intention. No podium, no press, just Grace, a chalkboard, and a room full of kids staring at her like she was somewhere between a myth and a miracle. She looked at one boy in the front row, Tariq, with restless eyes and a hoodie that didn't quite hide the bruises beneath his left sleeve. He didn't speak, didn't raise his hand, but he listened, hard. Grace always noticed the quiet ones. They reminded her of herself. Power, she told them, isn't just money or attention. It's the ability to make someone feel seen, to say, you exist, you matter, and I'm not going to walk past you like your wallpaper. That's power. A girl in the back asked, but didn't you already have all the money? Why go through all that? Why hide? Grace paused, thinking. Because if you inherit a kingdom but never walk among the people, you'll rule without empathy. You'll forget the weight of the crown, and worse, you'll never question whether you deserved it in the first place. That line made even Tariq lift his head a little higher. Afterward, the principal pulled Grace aside. They've had speakers before, she said, politicians, CEOs, no one ever kept them this quiet for an hour. Grace smiled. It's not about what you bring into the room, it's about how much you're willing to leave behind when you walk through the door. She left the school and walked the streets of Harlem alone. No bodyguard, no assistant, just Grace in her coat and scarf, hands tucked into her pockets. She passed the brownstone where her grandmother had once lived, where Olivia Ellis had raised a daughter and then a granddaughter on nothing but willpower and borrowed time. It hadn't changed much. The bricks still chipped in the same corner, the stoop still lane to the right. A little boy played on the sidewalk with a red rubber ball, and Grace had to blink against the sudden image of herself 20 years ago doing the same thing. She pressed her hand to the cool iron railing. This was where the dynasty had started, not in some corporate tower, but right here, on this street, among neighbors who shared sugar, shouted greetings from windows, and survived in community. This was what mattered. This was what grounded her. A call buzzed her phone. She checked the screen. Charlotte DeWitt. She answered. Hey, Grace said, her voice soft. I didn't want to text, Charlotte replied quickly. I needed to say this out loud. I'm listening. I had breakfast with my father, Charlotte said, and her tone already warned Grace that it hadn't gone well. He thinks this will blow over, that your moment will fade and the world will move on. He said you embarrassed yourself more than you embarrassed us. Grace closed her eyes briefly, unsurprised. I'm sorry, Charlotte added. He doesn't see it. He refuses to. Grace's voice was calm. He doesn't want to. He said I was choosing sides, Charlotte continued, her voice shaking now, like I'm betraying the family by even speaking to you. You're not betraying him, Grace said. You're redefining loyalty, and that terrifies people who only understand control. Charlotte was quiet. "Then can I see you?" Grace smiled. "Where are you?" "Downtown, but I can be." "I'll come to you," Grace said. "You've done enough chasing." They met at a small cafe near the edge of the financial district. Charlotte was already seated when Grace arrived, nervously stirring an untouched latte. She looked different, not in appearance, but in posture. She sat straighter now, but not in the stiff, self-conscious way she had before. There was something freer about her, something real. Grace slid into the booth across from her. "I didn't know if you'd still want to talk," Charlotte said. "Of course I do," Grace replied. "You didn't disappear when the world found out who I was. That says more about you than any last name ever could." Charlotte exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath since the moment they'd spoken on the phone. "I want to help," she said, "not performatively. I don't want credit. I've been reading, researching, listening. There are nonprofits doing incredible work in underfunded schools, grant writers who can't keep up with demand. I have resources, I have access. I want to use it for something that doesn't just benefit me." Grace nodded. "Then let's start with one school, one project. You help fund it, but you also work with it. Learn what they actually need, not what a press release says they need." Charlotte smiled. "Deal." Grace leaned in, and Charlotte. "Yes. Don't let your father's fear rewrite your convictions." "I won't," she said. And for the first time, Grace believed her. Back at the Amaranth, another change had begun brewing. The staff had started calling the service hallway behind the ballroom Ellis Way. A half-joke, half-reverence, they whispered it with pride. Some wore discreet pins shaped like brooms, an inside nod to Grace's origin story, not because they pitied her, but because she had carried that broom with dignity, and now she carried them with it. Preston Martin knocked gently on Grace's office door later that afternoon. She was reviewing budgets when he entered. "Something on your mind?" she asked. He stepped forward, a folder in hand. "There's a list of luxury investors asking to buy into the property now that the hotel's become, let's say, culturally relevant." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning they want to slap their names on the hotel now that you've made it famous." She took the folder, but didn't open it. "Tell them the Amaranth isn't for sale." Preston smiled, but his face was puzzled, even for expansion. "If we expand," she said, "we do it the right way. Pay equity, training programs, a leadership pipeline for staff from the bottom up. We don't just build a franchise, we build a model." Preston nodded slowly. "Then we'll need a new mission statement." "I'll write it," Grace said, "and it won't be for the guests." That night she walked the halls of the hotel like she used to, quietly, unnoticed, even though every face turned toward her with new admiration. She stopped by the housekeeping station and sat with the overnight team during their break. She shared coffee with a dishwasher who'd lost his wife the month before. She gave her business card to a receptionist studying for the LSAT. And then she returned to the same supply closet where she'd once cried silently after being insulted by a guest on her first week. It was still cluttered, still smelled like bleach and plastic gloves. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she whispered, "Thank you," and closed it gently behind her. Because even the places that hurt you have a right to be remembered, especially when they made you stronger. In the days that followed, the hotel lobby became a strange kind of crossroads. Businessmen in tailored suits still arrived with rolling luggage and Bluetooth calls. Wealthy couples still checked in with assistants and expectations. But alongside them now came journalists with notebooks, students holding copies of Grace's public statement, and travelers who wanted more than a 5-star stay. They wanted to see where dignity had made its stand. And though the Amaranth service remained flawless, something intangible had shifted. The staff walked straighter. The back-of-house corridors held laughter where silence once ruled. It wasn't arrogance. It was permission to be human, to matter, to not be erased behind a job title. Grace spent her mornings in meetings, staff planning, HR restructuring, union consultations, but her afternoons she gave to stories. Each day she met one employee. One-on-one, no cameras, no PR team. She called it her listening hour. First came Lian, the Vietnamese night cleaner who'd worked silently for 10 years. Her son had just been accepted to Columbia, and she didn't know how to tell him she'd kept working double shifts to make it happen. Grace made a call, a scholarship was arranged. Lian cried, not from relief, but from the shock of being noticed. Next was Javier from maintenance, a brilliant problem solver with a stammer that had kept him from ever applying for promotion. Grace listened to him explain how he'd redesigned the boiler schedule to cut energy waste by 14%, a detail no one had asked for in 5 years. "Would you lead a workshop on hotel sustainability?" Grace asked him. He stared, eyes wide. "Me?" "Yes, you," she said. "If you can fix pipes in your sleep, you can teach people how not to flood their buildings." And then there was Pearl, an older woman from Georgia who'd been a linen manager for 22 years. She handed Grace a folded slip of paper during their meeting. Grace unfolded it gently. It was a prayer. "For you," Pearl said, "not because I think you need saving, but because even brave people deserve covering." Grace thanked her quietly, heart swelling. She wasn't changing lives. She was just returning visibility to people who'd long since been blurred into the background. On the 5th day after the gala, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the Amaranth Valet Circle. The driver opened the rear door. James DeWitt stepped out. He wasn't dressed for media, no suit, no tie, just a grey coat and weary eyes. He moved through the lobby with the poise of someone who didn't know how to shrink, even when he should. Grace watched from the mezzanine balcony above. She didn't move, not yet. She wanted to see what he did without an audience. He approached the front desk. Tommy greeted him with a professional nod. "Welcome to the Amaranth, Mr. DeWitt." James didn't flinch. "I'm here to see Grace Ellis." Tommy tapped a few keys. "One moment." He called upstairs. Grace answered. "James DeWitt is here," Tommy said carefully. "Says he's here to speak with you." Grace didn't hesitate. "Send him to conference room B." 10 minutes later, he walked into the same conference room where she'd once stood silently at the back, pouring water for guests who'd spoken about economic empowerment without once looking her in the eye. Now she sat at the head of the table. James closed the door behind him. "I assume this isn't a request for a tour," Grace said calmly. "No," he replied, "it's a reckoning." She gestured to the seat across from her. He didn't sit immediately. He walked the perimeter of the room first, glancing at the art on the walls. Abstract, clean, safe. "I read your statement," he said finally, taking the chair. "I figured. You said you didn't want vengeance." "I don't," she said, "but I also don't believe in letting people walk away from their mess without knowing what they spilled." James folded his hands. "I was raised to believe that success justifies itself, that hard work, my hard work, was the only metric that mattered." Grace tilted her head. "So when you saw me with a mop, you assumed I'd failed." He nodded once, or never tried at all. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. "I came here," he said, "because my daughter told me you deserved to be heard, and because I'm starting to realize she's braver than I've ever been." Grace's voice was steady. "She is." James looked down. "You were kind to her. She earned it." He looked up, "And I didn't." She met his gaze without blinking. "You treated me like I was disposable, and worse, you taught your children to do the same." James's shoulders tensed. He didn't defend himself. For once, he listened. "I don't want your apology," Grace continued. "Not unless it changes something. What I do want is for you to go home, look in the mirror, and ask yourself who you've been performing for your entire life." He exhaled sharply. "And if the answer is yourself," she added, then maybe it's time to question what kind of man you're proud to be when no one's watching. Silence. Then would you ever consider working with me, he asked, if I listened, learned, changed? Grace considered it, then shook her head. I'm not here to rehabilitate legacies, I'm here to build futures. If you want to help fund something real, quietly, without banners. James nodded, almost gratefully, that I can do. He stood, hands still clenched. Thank you for not destroying us. I didn't spare you, Grace said. I just gave you the chance to dismantle yourself. He left, and Grace remained in the room, staring out the window at the skyline beyond. The city hadn't changed, but some of its ghosts had finally begun to speak. Later that night, Grace sat on the rooftop garden of the Amaranth, a place few knew existed. It had been built for VIPs, but rarely used. Now it was hers. She lit a candle and placed it beside her on the bench. Her grandmother had loved candles. Flame reminds you the light came from something that dared to burn, she'd said. She pulled out Olivia's journal and flipped to a bookmarked page. There will be moments when the world will ask you to be quieter than you were born to be. Don't shrink, don't whisper, don't wait for applause, rise anyway. Grace closed the book and leaned back, letting the wind move through her hair. Below her, the Amaranth glowed like a ship in calm water. Inside its walls, lives were being seen, voices were rising, and power, real human power, was shifting, inch by inch, from the hands that had always taken to the hands that had always built. She didn't need revenge. She had revolution. And it had begun with a broom. The following week unfolded like a quiet tide turning. No explosions, no lawsuits, no high drama, just small shifts, purposeful, powerful, like gears clicking into alignment after years of misdirection. In the executive wing of the Amaranth, where polished wood panels lined the corridors and meetings once echoed with words like shareholder interest and brand positioning, something unprecedented happened. For the first time in the hotel's history, housekeeping had a seat at the strategy table. It wasn't symbolic. Grace made it policy. Every quarterly leadership meeting now included 2 rotating representatives from each department, including janitorial, laundry, maintenance, and catering. No one wore suits. Everyone wore name tags. At the first meeting, Maria sat beside Preston Martin, the director of operations, holding a notepad she didn't use because she'd memorized her points. When she spoke about the need for staggered cleaning shifts to reduce burnout, the room fell silent, not out of condescension, but out of revelation. People who'd run hotels for decades suddenly realized they never asked the people who ran the hotel what they actually needed. That was Grace's design. She didn't just want reform. She wanted re-education. Meanwhile, outside the Amaranth, the ripple effect continued. In Boston, a luxury hotel announced it was increasing staff wages and adding mental health days, inspired by the Ellis model, their press release read. In San Diego, a popular influencer who'd filmed herself berating a hotel staffer on TikTok issued a public apology and made a donation to the Olivia Ellis Fellowship. And in New York City, the Department of Labor launched a pilot initiative to conduct anonymous interviews with hospitality workers in 5-star hotels, assessing conditions with new sensitivity protocols. Grace didn't comment publicly on any of it. She didn't need to. The legacy was moving, quietly, permanently. One evening, as the fall wind began to carry the first bite of winter through the city, Grace found herself back in the hotel's library. It was a rarely visited room on the mezzanine level, once designed for old-money guests who preferred cigars and novels over room service apps and rooftop selfies. Over the years, it had become a dusty time capsule, lined with leather-bound books, a cracked globe, and shelves full of forgotten guest registries from decades ago. Grace loved it. She brought a tea kettle up, poured herself a cup of chamomile, and sat in the leather armchair by the bay window. She was alone for all of 10 minutes before she heard the soft creak of the door opening behind her. "Didn't think you'd find me up here," she said without turning. "I didn't," Charlotte said. "Tommy told me." Grace smiled as Charlotte entered, carrying 2 paper bags and a bottle of elderflower lemonade. "Don't say I never bring gifts," Charlotte said, handing over one of the bags. Grace peeked inside. "Is this the peanut butter cake from Alora?" Charlotte smirked. "Of course, I bribed the manager, said it was for a revolution." They sat down, pulling their chairs closer to the bay window. The lights of Manhattan flickered across the glass, painting the room in gold and gray. "I needed this," Charlotte said quietly. "Today was a lot." "What happened?" "My brother tried to go on a podcast," she said, rolling her eyes. "Tried to reframe the gala incident as a social experiment he supported all along." Grace winced. And Ava posted a passive-aggressive quote about loyalty and family on her story. "We haven't spoken since that night." "You're doing the hard thing," Grace said. "They're doing the easy thing." Charlotte picked at the edge of the paper bag. "I don't want to fight them forever. I just want them to look at the world the way I'm learning to, with less arrogance, more awe." Grace nodded. "Awe is dangerous to people raised on certainty." "I was one of them." "You were," Grace said, "but not anymore." Charlotte glanced at her, eyes full of cautious hope. "How do you know?" "Because you're here. You brought cake instead of control. That's evolution." They laughed softly. Charlotte's expression turned more serious. "I want to do something real, not performative, not a band-aid, but something foundational." Grace sipped her tea. "You still thinking about education?" "Every day." "Then let's start with a school," Grace said. "Not just funding it, embedding into it, listening to students, parents, teachers, rebuilding a system from the inside out." Charlotte's eyes lit up. "You do it with me." "I'd hold the door," Grace said. "You'd have to walk through it." "I will," Charlotte said, then caught herself. "No, I want to. That matters more, right?" Grace nodded. Outside, sirens hummed like lullabies. The city below rushed on, but the library stayed still. 2 women, a table between them, cake cooling in paper, a revolution in real time. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mailroom. No return address, just Grace's name, handwritten in slanted ink. She opened it alone, sitting in the service corridor where she'd once eaten lunch on a crate of laundry detergent. The letter read, "Grace, you don't know me, but I know you now. I was the maid who cleaned the suite before you. I lasted 3 weeks. They told me to smile more. They said I was lucky to be invisible. I started to believe them. Then you happened. You didn't burn the system down. You made it look in the mirror. That's harder. Thank you for staying, for not quitting, for proving to every woman who's ever been overlooked that silence isn't the same as peace. Nadia." Grace folded the letter slowly and tucked it into her journal. Not all victories needed cameras. Some came in envelopes. At the staff lounge later that afternoon, the TV was playing quietly in the background. A news anchor was interviewing a hospitality CEO who had just pledged $10 million to improve working conditions across 10 luxury hotel chains. "Do you think Grace Ellis embarrassed the industry into change?" the anchor asked. The CEO chuckled. "No," he said. "She reminded us what leadership looks like when it's not afraid of humility." Maria turned the volume up. Miguel clapped. Grace, passing through on her way to the elevator, heard the last sentence but didn't stop walking. Let the world talk. She had more work to do. That night, in a private upstairs office, she opened a new document. Title: The Ellis Standard, a framework for ethical hospitality. Below it, she typed the first line. The goal is not to shame the privileged. The goal is to raise the floor beneath the forgotten. She smiled and kept typing. By the time Grace had written 10 full pages of the Ellis Standard, something surprising happened. The industry started listening. Not politely, not performatively, really listening. Her framework wasn't just a list of suggestions for better hospitality operations. It was a manifesto written from the inside, crafted by someone who had scrubbed the baseboards and sat in budget meetings alike. She knew the ecosystem, from mop handle to boardroom, better than any executive with a consulting firm behind them. At its core, the Ellis Standard was simple. Treat employees like guests. Build systems where workers don't just earn, they rise. Make dignity a budget line. Visibility is not a reward, it's a right. If your success depends on silence, it's not success, it's servitude. It wasn't radical, but it was real. And that was enough to shake a $500 billion industry into motion. By week's end, 5 boutique hotels in major cities signed on to adopt the standard. Within 2 more weeks, 2 international chains had reached out asking to license the model at cost, with implementation training provided by Grace's foundation. Grace reviewed every proposal herself. And she had one rule: the Ellis Standard cannot be used in marketing until it's proven in payroll. When one chain tried to launch a PR campaign with Grace's name in the tagline, she called their CEO directly and shut it down. "This isn't branding," she told him flatly, "it's accountability." He got the message. Charlotte's transformation also deepened. She began showing up to meetings with a notebook full of questions, genuine, sometimes messy, never performative. She interned with a grassroots education nonprofit uptown and volunteered as a classroom aide in an overcrowded public school twice a week. One morning, Grace found her in the hotel kitchen at 6:45 a.m., tying an apron around her waist. "Didn't peg you for a prep shift, girl," Grace teased. "I'm shadowing Chef Lion today," Charlotte said. "She's training me to make breakfast for 100 guests on 20 minutes of sleep." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is the educational value in that?" Charlotte grinned. "Humility, patience, timing." Grace laughed. "Those are also the ingredients for leadership." Charlotte was learning not just through books, but by peeling onions until her eyes burned and lifting trays until her arms shook. And she never once asked for special treatment. Grace watched with quiet admiration. This wasn't some rebrand. It was redemption earned in real time. But not everyone was clapping. One morning, Melinda called. "We've got a situation," she said. Grace paused mid-step. "Legal." "No, personal." Grace's chest tightened. "What is it?" "Your parents are giving interviews." Grace stopped walking, her breath caught. "They're saying they tried to reach out," Melinda continued, "that they were cut off from you, that the inheritance should have been shared. The narrative is not kind." Grace sat down on the edge of a planter in the lobby, her gaze falling to the floor tiles. She hadn't thought about them in months. She'd spent 2 years actively avoiding the past they represented, their bitterness, their blame, their failure to protect. She hadn't expected love. But the smear campaign still strung. "Let them speak," she said after a long pause. "I won't fight shadows." "Are you sure?" Melinda asked. "I can prepare a response." "No," Grace said. "Let the world see the contrast. I won't fight back with noise. I'll build louder with action." Melinda went quiet for a beat. Then, "That's exactly what Olivia would have said." Grace hung up and walked to her office, heart heavier than usual. She wasn't immune to pain. Her calm was a discipline, not an absence of wounds. That night, she pulled out Olivia's journal again. She flipped until she found a page she hadn't touched in months. "Blood may tie us, but only truth defines us." Grace exhaled, closed the book, and made a decision. The following Saturday, the Amaranth hosted a community forum. No gala, no tuxedos, just rows of folding chairs in the ballroom, open doors, free childcare, and food served by the hotel's kitchen staff at long, family-style tables. Grace stood at the front of the room in a navy blouse and jeans. The topic was simple: what do you need to feel seen in this city? It started with timid hands, soft voices. But before long, the stories poured out. A doorman who'd been denied promotion because of his accent, a dishwasher whose housing situation made him ineligible for bank loans, a young mother who cleaned rooms by day and attended night classes online from a second-hand phone, a former guest who admitted they'd never tipped because it never occurred to them the people working in five-star hotels had lives off the clock. The walls of the Amaranth, once dressed in formality, now echoed with rawness. Grace didn't speak for long. She didn't need to. She just listened. And then she stood and said, "We'll make this monthly, we'll rotate neighborhoods, and we'll build from these rooms, not from the top down, but from the street up." The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was earned. 1 week later, the Ellis Standard received its first major award. The National Hospitality Council named it the most impactful industry reform of the decade. Grace was invited to speak at the ceremony. She declined. Instead, she sent Pearl, the linen manager with the handwritten prayer, to accept on behalf of the hotel staff. Pearl stood on stage in her church best, trembling hands gripping the podium, and said, "I've folded enough sheets in this lifetime to wrap a city in cotton, but it wasn't until this year that I felt what it meant to be unfolded, to be known, not just used. Grace Ellis gave us that, and now we're giving it to others." The room stood, not because Pearl was eloquent, but because she was true. Back in her office, Grace watched the speech from her laptop. Tears ran silently down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. They weren't weakness, they were clarity. The work wasn't finished, but it was finally visible. By late November, the city had begun to dress itself in winter's first whispers, trees stripped bare, sidewalks dusted with the early sighs of frost. But inside the Amaranth Hotel, warmth had become a living thing. It wasn't just in the thermostats or the holiday garlands now climbing the railings. It was in the eyes of the staff who greeted guests without fear of reprimand, in the bulletin board filled with scholarships and internal job postings, in the hum of a place that had stopped pretending and started transforming. Grace walked the halls every day, not as a figurehead, but as a presence. She still greeted every department by name. She still ate in the staff lounge when no one expected her, and when she passed a mirror, she sometimes had to remind herself that she no longer blended in. She was the mirror now, and the city was still adjusting to its reflection. In her office, Grace sifted through a folder of proposals. One of them was from Charlotte. It was detailed, annotated, and handwritten. Proposal: the Bridge Program. It outlined a pilot partnership between the Olivia Ellis Foundation and 3 underfunded public schools. The idea was simple but radical. Instead of merely funding supplies, they'd embed trained staff from the hospitality world into the schools as mentors, coordinators, and behind-the-scenes infrastructure guides, helping the schools function more like places of pride than survival. Custodians would be given management tools. Cafeteria workers would have seats in budget discussions. Office staff would be offered leadership training. The adults that kept the school moving would be elevated, just as they had been at the Amaranth. The thesis was bold and beautiful. When you dignify the foundation, the whole structure stands taller. Grace smiled, underlining that sentence in soft pencil. Charlotte arrived minutes later, practically bouncing with nervous energy. "Well," she asked, "too ambitious?" "Not at all," Grace said, handing the folder back. "It's the right kind of impossible, which means it's necessary." Charlotte exhaled in relief. "We'll need district approvals, vetting, government partners." "We'll get them," Grace said. "Start with one school, we show them, not tell them." Charlotte's eyes gleamed. "You mean I lead it?" Grace nodded. "It's your vision, I'll fund it, you build it." Charlotte didn't cry, but she looked close. Grace leaned back. You've come a long way. I had a map, Charlotte said quietly. You. That night, as snow flirted with the edges of the skyline, Grace returned to the old brownstone in Harlem, where her grandmother had raised her. It was being renovated now, slowly, respectfully. Grace had bought it back from the management company that had converted it to overpriced rentals. She didn't plan to live there. She planned to turn it into the Olivia Ellis Learning House, a place for community workshops, tutoring, career development, and memory. But tonight it was still hollow, just bare floors, scaffolding, dust. She sat on the wooden stoop with a thermos of tea and let the wind nip at her cheeks. A neighbor walked by with groceries and did a double take. You're her, he said. Grace smiled. I might be. You brought this place back. Grace looked at the bricks, trying to. My mother used to live 2 doors down. She said your grandma taught half the block how to budget, said she was a storm with good shoes. Grace laughed. That sounds right. He adjusted his scarf. She'd be proud of you. I hope so, Grace said. She would, he said, walking on. The street was quiet again, not silent, just still. And that's when the tears came, not from sadness, not from stress, from fulfillment. She had brought the Ellis name full circle. Not upward. Outward. The next day, Grace walked into the Amaranth's event office and made an announcement. We are doing one final gala this year, she said, but it's going to look different. The team, now used to surprises, waited in silence. It's not for donors, Grace continued. It's not for the press. It's for the people who have built this place, swept its halls, held its secrets, and never asked for anything but a little grace. She looked around. No tuxedos, no step and repeat, no sponsorships, just music, food, and a celebration of survival. A staff holiday gala. But not just a staff party. A declaration. 2 weeks later, the ballroom transformed once again. Gone were the velvet ropes and corporate logos. In their place, fairy lights strung across the ceiling, buffet tables lined with comfort food from every country represented among the staff, and a playlist curated by Miguel himself, who doubled as DJ that night under the alias Spin Master M. Charlotte arrived early and helped hang banners. Maria baked 4 pies. Pearl brought her church choir. Preston, initially nervous, showed up in a reindeer sweater and stunned everyone by leading a karaoke rendition of Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Even James DeWitt, invited quietly, arrived with no fanfare and stood in the back with a paper plate of food and no entourage. He didn't speak, he watched. When Grace finally stepped onto the small makeshift stage near the punch table, she didn't need to ask for attention. It came. She raised her glass, not of champagne but sparkling apple cider, and said, Here, to every person who ever felt unseen, you are the reason this place shines, not the chandeliers, you. Applause erupted. To those who lifted others while holding broken pieces of themselves, thank you. Applause louder. And to the next chapter, one where your stories aren't whispered behind the scenes, but shouted from the front. The cheer that followed shook the walls. That night, no one served. Everyone was served. And Grace, once the invisible woman in a uniform, danced barefoot beneath the fairy lights, surrounded by the very people she'd once cleaned up after, now lifting her higher than any elevator ever could. Near midnight, Charlotte found her at the edge of the ballroom, watching the dancing, cheeks flushed. We did it, Charlotte said. Grace smiled. No, they did it. We just made sure they had a mic. Charlotte leaned against the wall. You ever think about what comes next? Grace nodded. All the time. Are you scared? Of course, Grace said, but I'm not hiding anymore. Fear's a cost I'm willing to pay. Charlotte grinned. Same. They stood there a while, 2 women on opposite sides of where the story had started, now shoulder to shoulder in the middle of something larger. Not an ending. A legacy. Still unfolding. It was the final morning of the year. Outside, New York stretched under a blanket of pearl gray fog, buildings softened at the edges like a city caught between sleep and memory. The Amaranth Hotel glowed quietly in the stillness, an old structure with new breath in its walls, waiting, watching, holding stories like lungs hold air. Grace Ellis stood alone in Suite 1701, the one where her journey had nearly ended before it truly began. She had returned not out of nostalgia, but reverence. The room hadn't changed much. The furniture remained sleek, the city skyline still framed the windows like a painting that refused to age, but the energy was different. It no longer hummed with tension or status. It was quiet, still, cleansed. She walked across the carpet, her steps slow and barefoot, and stopped in front of the mirror. The same mirror that once reflected a housekeeper the world refused to see. She looked at herself now. No uniform, no mask, just Grace. Whole. Same. A woman made not from fortune, but from fire and patience, and the stubborn refusal to become bitter. On the small table by the couch sat Olivia's journal, worn soft by time. Grace picked it up and flipped to the final page, a blank one. She hadn't dared write in it before. Now she did. December 31st, the year everything broke, and revealed what was worth building again, not in spite of being unseen. Because of it, may the next eyes that look through these windows see every human in the room, not just the ones at the table. She closed the journal and pressed her palm against its cover. This is the ending you earned, Grandma, she whispered, and the beginning you gave me. Downstairs, preparations were underway for the Foundation's New Year's luncheon, a quiet affair by design. No celebrities, no red carpet, no curated guest list. Instead, they had invited 100 people, educators, union workers, youth counselors, former housekeepers, cafeteria staff, small business owners, scholarship recipients, and elders from Harlem who remembered Olivia Ellis when she was just that fierce little woman who argued with landlords in her Sunday heels. Charlotte handled the schedule, Preston ran point with the staff. Grace, for once, simply arrived. As she entered the grand dining room, heads turned, not with awe, but with warmth. People clapped, some rose, many smiled. It wasn't applause for a leader, it was recognition for a member of their tribe. She greeted each table like an old friend. At one table, a former Amaranth bellhop now studying finance. At another, a janitor who used to commute 4 hours daily, now newly hired into building management thanks to the Ellis Fellowship. Further down, a teacher who'd used her grant to build a reading corner from scratch, and a girl, 10, shy, radiant, who had read 147 books in the last year and thought Grace was like a princess, but real. Grace knelt beside her. "Guess what?" she whispered. "You're the real royalty here." When the luncheon ended, and hugs were exchanged, and photographs taken on Polaroids instead of iPhones, Grace slipped away into the hotel's library once more. It had become her favorite place. And she wasn't surprised when, a few moments later, someone quietly entered behind her. It was Charlotte. "Thought I'd find you in here," she said, holding 2 mugs. "Still bringing tea?" Grace asked, amused. "Still learning from the best." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that only exists between people who have earned trust the long way. "Do you ever miss it?" Charlotte asked suddenly, "before all this?" Grace thought about that. "The invisibility?" she asked. "Yeah. Sometimes," Grace admitted. "It's quieter, safer, but it also shrinks you." Charlotte nodded. "I think I was addicted to comfort. Now I crave meaning." "That's evolution," Grace said. Outside, faint fireworks cracked against the gray, early celebrations from other neighborhoods carrying on the wind. Charlotte looked at her. "What will you do next year?" Grace smiled. "Not retreat. That's enough of a plan for now." Charlotte laughed. "You." Charlotte paused. build the bridge program into 10 schools, and maybe, just maybe, reconcile with my mom. She's not my father, she's just lost. Grace nodded gently. We make room for people when they're ready. Charlotte tilted her head. Think your parents will ever try to reach out again? They already did, Grace said, her tone soft but steady. Through the press. That was their version of love, loud and performative. Charlotte didn't push further. Later that night, the city counted down. Grace didn't stand in Times Square. She didn't sip champagne. Instead, she stood on the roof of the Amaranth, bundled in a long coat, flanked by her closest circle, Charlotte, Maria, Pearl, Miguel, Leon, and a dozen others who'd walked beside her when the world didn't yet know her name. They weren't talking, just watching. Fireworks lit up the skyline, reds and golds and blues painting over concrete like a celebration the city had saved just for them. I used to watch this from the staff stairwell, Maria said. One floor above the boiler, could only see one sliver of sky. Well, Grace said, smiling, now you've got the whole view. Pearl let out a whoop as another burst exploded above them. Someone began playing music from a Bluetooth speaker tucked in a backpack. A slow, rich classic, Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come. No one danced. They just stood in it, let it move through them. Let it affirm everything that had come undone and remade them. At midnight, Grace stepped back inside, down the stairwell, past the laundry floor, and into the staff break room, now beautifully redone with soft lights, comfortable couches, and framed portraits of Amaranth's longest-serving employees lining the walls. She sat alone on the couch, closed her eyes, and let herself feel everything. Joy, sorrow, exhaustion, gratitude. She whispered a prayer she hadn't said since the day Olivia died. Thank you for the burden, thank you for the broom, thank you for the chance to be more than a shadow in someone else's room. Then she opened her eyes and stood, not because the story was over, but because it was finally hers. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about how we treat the invisible, the underestimated, the ones walking beside us every day, then don't just scroll away. Don't let this be just another video you watched in passing. Take a moment, ask yourself, who have I ignored today? Who have I passed by without acknowledgement? Who is holding this world together while the rest of us look away? Because the truth is, you don't need $1 billion inheritance to make a difference. You just need to care. You just need to see people, not their uniforms, not their job titles, not their silence, but them. The next time someone hands you your keys, brings you a towel, cleans the floor you walk on, look them in the eye. Say thank you, mean it. And if you have the power to speak up when someone else is being disrespected, use it. Grace Ellis didn't change the world with anger. She changed it with awareness. And now it's your turn. If this story inspired you, share it, tell someone, spark a conversation, let it ripple. Drop a comment below. What was your moment of awakening? Have you ever felt invisible? Or better yet, have you ever helped someone else feel seen? Subscribe for more true stories that reveal the power in places most people overlook. Like this video if it made you pause. And if you've ever been told your voice doesn't matter, remember Grace. She cleaned rooms no one thanked her for. Then she took the mic. And the whole world listened. Now it's your turn to speak. Are you ready?